I think we'll move on to our second talk, which is by Jacob Brusin. He's going to give both the second talk as well as the talk after that virtually on Zoom.
Hi, I'm Jake. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So I actually decided to switch the order which is given on the program because it just makes more sense conceptually to give this one first. So apologies if that causes any confusion. But okay, so my name's Jake Rustin. I'm a PhD student. Well, let me just move this out of the way. A PhD student in the Computational Cognitive Neuroscience Lab at UC Davis, run by Randy O'Reilly. And in this work, we use neural network models and fMRI to investigate the geometry of map-like representations under dynamic cognitive control. And this was done in collaboration with another graduate student in the lab, Mariam Zulfigar. We did the kind of computational modeling part mostly. And then Alex Park and Yuri Borman did the fMRI design and data collection and analysis. So substantial evidence suggests that the brain organizes incoming relational information into map-like representations. This is true in both spatial domains or environments, famously with place cells and grid cells in hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, for example, but it's also true in non-spatial domains. For example, when humans are presented with a multidimensional social hierarchy that they're learning, representations in entorhinal cortex, hippocampus, and orbitofrontal cortex will encode dimensions of this abstract social hierarchy. And these representations are map-like in the sense that nearby locations, for example, in space, are encoded with similar patterns, and far apart locations, or people that are kind of dissimilar in this social hierarchy, will be encoded with dissimilar representations. And this is thought to be useful for making inferences. For example, if you're an animal that's just taking these black paths here, but you encode the structure of the space with map-like representations, then it's thought that this will help you kind of infer the relations that you haven't yet seen shown in red. However, humans and other animals are goal-directed, and so even though you may know quite a bit about a particular domain, many dimensions, only some of these dimensions or features may be relevant to the current goal or context at any given time. And so that's where cognitive control, or the capacity to flexibly attend to the features that are currently the most relevant to your current goal or context, becomes important. So this can be illustrated with the classic Stroop task, where you either have to name the color or read the word. So in congruent trials, it's not a big deal because these two features kind of agree. But in incongruent trials, where the color does not match the word, that's where you have to kind of exert some top-down attention in order to focus on whether your current goal, whether it's reading the word or naming the color. Prominent computational theories emphasize that the prefrontal cortex plays an important role in top-down modulation of other brain areas in order to coordinate activity to accomplish the current goal, whether it's color naming or word reading. So in this work, we investigate how this kind of cognitive control process might interact with these sort of map-like representations. And again, we're using fMRI data. This is data that was actually previously published in Park et al. 2020, but we're reanalyzing it in light of some new theoretical motivations, and also in light of neural network models that we train on the exact same task so that we can compare their representations. So here's the task from Park et al. 2020. It's slightly complicated, but basically it's what I was describing before, where participants have to learn the relative ranks of 16 hypothetical people in this two-dimensional social hierarchy, one dimension being popularity, the other being competence. And the participants learn these relative ranks through pairwise comparisons. So on each trial, they see a Q. This indicates the context, whether it's popularity or a competence trial. And then they are asked who ranks higher of these two faces along this particular dimension. And so unknown to the participants, these faces are arranged like shown here in a 4x4 grid on these two dimensions. And so this makes the task useful for measuring the formation of abstract map-like representations, because the participants aren't explicitly instructed on this 4x4 grid structure, but we can measure the extent to which the representations in certain brain areas capture this kind of two-dimensional 4x4 grid structure. And it's also useful for investigating cognitive control in this context, because on any particular trial, you have to be using only one of the two dimensions to evaluate who ranks higher. And furthermore, we can make an analogy with the Stroop task and define a notion of congruence in this task, where a congruent pair of faces, we can call it, is one where one of the faces is kind of ranks higher on both of the two dimensions. So this face ranks higher in competence and also in popularity. Whereas an incongruent pair is one where one of the faces ranks higher on one dimension and the other face ranks higher on the other dimension. And so it's just like the Stroop task, it's these incongruent pairs of faces where you really need to use the context to disambiguate what the correct response should be. So our approach, again, is to use a neural network model and compare it to representations in the brain. So the model we use for this task is just a recurrent neural network, a pretty standard long short-term memory network with a convolutional neural network to process the images. And this network is trained on the exact same task, complete with the 4x4 grid structure and everything. And we don't, just like the participants weren't explicitly instructed on the 4x4 grid, the model is learning through pairwise comparisons alone. And so we don't kind of build in the 2D grid structure at all. And so we take representations from the model and from the brain and can compare them and test hypotheses using representational similarity analysis. So our first hypothesis was that this 2D grid structure, again, although it's not explicitly instructed in either the model or to the participants, will emerge in the representations of the brain. And this was actually already established in the previous publication here, Park et al. 2020, where they find, again, that hippocampus, entorhinal cortex, and orbital frontal cortex all capture this 2D grid structure in the sense that the similarity between representations of faces are sensitive to or correlated with Euclidean distances in this ground truth grid, which was latent or implicit. So the representations are capturing this kind of 4x4 grid structure. And we can test the same hypothesis in the model. Oh God, yes, my screen is kind of cut off here. Okay, yeah. Where here I'm plotting the t-value for the same hypothesis test done on the representations of the model. So you can see it kind of over the course of training. So you can see it surpasses threshold pretty early in training and is maintained that way throughout training. So overall, we find that the model can replicate the finding from the fMRI study where its representations are capturing this 2D structure, even though it's learning from pairwise comparisons alone. So now that we know that the map-like representations emerge in the model and in the brain, we can ask our kind of crucial question, which is how might these map-like representations be modulated according to the current context? So for example, in the popularity context by itself, if you just take the trials where popularity was the Q, this blue Q, we might guess that, according to the theory of cognitive control, that in the popularity trials, that the other dimension, the irrelevant dimension, the red dimension, competence, would be compressed. This dimension of the representations would be compressed relative to the to the currently relevant dimension, popularity. And likewise, in the competence trials, the popularity dimension would be compressed, or equivalently, the competence dimension of the representations would be kind of expanded or selected. And so overall, we predict that in both contexts, the irrelevant dimension is compressed relative to the relevant one. And so what we find in the fMRI data is that the dorsomedial frontal cortex and the posterior area of posterior medial parietal cortex here show evidence for this kind of compression of the irrelevant dimension, which is consistent with some previous work and also with this theory of cognitive control. And in the model, we didn't build in any special capacity for compression or anything like that. And yet we see this compression emerge throughout the course of training, where this is the t-value now for this hypothesis test about whether the irrelevant dimensions are compressed. So overall, we're finding that the map-like representations are there in their full 2D structure, but also certain areas of the brain will compress the irrelevant dimensions, making the relevant dimensions more salient for the current context. And a portion of the variance in the model's representations can be explained by this sort of compression as well. Okay, so lastly, we try to see if there is an effect of congruence on the geometry of the map-like representations. So in particular, we can compare the average distance between a congruent pair of faces. Again, this is one where one of the faces is higher on both dimensions, to the average distance between an incongruent pair where one of the faces is higher in one dimension, the other face is higher in the other dimension. And so really what we're testing here, if you think geometrically about it, is the degree to which the map is warped or sheared along one of the two diagonals here, either this congruent main diagonal or the incongruent diagonal. That's because all of the congruent pairs end up being, kind of in this direction, whereas all the incongruent pairs end up being on the other direction. So what we're really testing is the extent to which the map is sheared in one or the other, along one or the other of the diagonals. And it turns out that in the hippocampus, we see an effect on the group level where in the hippocampus, the representations between congruent pairs were more dissimilar than on average than the representations between the representations of incongruent pairs of faces. And furthermore, the degree to which the map is warped in this way along the congruent diagonal in medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex, the degree to which those maps were warped was correlated with individual differences in cognitive control, which here means the difference between the reaction time on incongruent trials and the reaction time on congruent trials. So basically, the participants who had the slowest reaction times on the incongruent trials, they were the ones with the most warping in the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex. And so this was kind of surprising. We didn't exactly expect this warping, but when we checked in the model, again, without changing anything or building anything in, whether this warping was there, we found that indeed it was. So here I'm plotting now the level of warping on the y-axis, which is just this ratio between congruent and incongruent trials, the distances. And you can see that it's consistently above 1, meaning the congruent pairs of faces were further apart from each other than the incongruent pairs of faces. And so to dig a little deeper into why this warping happens, we can do ablation study, which is nice because we have a model and we could do an experiment that we wouldn't be able to do in humans. So we simulate this ablation where we weaken the context information by multiplying this vector representing the context by some number between 0 and 1. And what we find is that the more that you weaken the context information, the greater the warping that emerges throughout the course of learning. So that was some insight that led us to this interpretation where this warping, it reflects a failure to integrate the context, or a failure to exert cognitive control to focus on the current context throughout learning. So just as a quick little thought experiment here, imagine that you were trying to do this task without any context information whatsoever. So you were just trying to guess who ranked higher without actually knowing whether it's a popularity or a competence trial. The optimal thing to do here would be to create a kind of one-dimensional map, which combines the other two dimensions, where the top of the hierarchy is this person who is the most competent and popular. The bottom is this person who is kind of ranks last in both, and then everyone else kind of falls somewhere in between. And this one-dimensional combined dimension is also, if you think about it, the perfectly warped map. It's like all of the variance is along this congruent diagonal. And so I think this helps to explain why when we kind of make the model more like this scenario where we're weakening the context, we see greater warping. The map becomes more like this single combined dimension. And also in the brain, why those individuals that kind of struggled with the incongruent trials the most, i.e. the ones where context was most important for disambiguating the correct response, those individuals that struggled the most with those trials had the greatest warping in the medial prefrontal cortex and posterior cingulate cortex. So their maps in those brain areas were more like this kind of single combined dimension. Okay, so to summarize, we had a neural network model and fMRI data that investigated the interaction between cognitive control and map-like representations. And we see this 2D grid structure emerge in these representations. And we also observed that these map-like representations were compressed along the irrelevant dimension according to the current context. And finally, we show that the geometry of the representations was affected by the level at which participants were exerting cognitive control or integrating the current context into their decisions during learning. So thanks for your attention, and I'll take any questions.
Hello, great talk and very interesting model. The one sort of small, tiny technical question, can you go back to where you were scaling the context signal?
Yes.
Yeah, that slide there. I've done that sort of thing before in the past, and sometimes I just find that because Backprop is also learning that, it just cancels out my scaling. Because if we're just scaling a factor there, a neural network still has access to all that information. It can just scale up the other weights to compensate. Did that just not happen in this case, or am I missing something in the model here?
Yes, that is a great point. So I would have expected that as well, that, basically Backprop has control over the scale of these weights, so it could just perfectly cancel this W if it wanted to. But the thing about this is that actually there's, many possible solutions, all of which get, basically 100% accuracy on the training set. And so, you can get 100% with a very warped map, basically. Because, in principle, if you have any 2D information here, you can read off the correct answers, even if it is very warped. And so basically this W, Backprop didn't need to counteract it perfectly because it could still get it still could bring its test loss to zero, its training loss to zero. Does that make sense?
Oh, awesome. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we can move on to your next talk, Jacob.